My Lords, I wish to speak to Amendment 177A, which is in my name and the names of my co-signatories, Lord Alton, Lord McCall, and Baroness Healy. My Lords, Amendment 177A requires that the Secretary of State must commission a person to investigate the impact of the access to online pornography by children on domestic abuse. It further requires that the appointed person must publish a report on the investigation, and that if they recommend that Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act 2017 should be implemented, then the Secretary of State must appoint a day for that coming into force of that part under Section 118(6) of the Act. My Lords, some may ask, why is Amendment 177A central to the Domestic Abuse Bill? Well, my Lords, during the passage of this bill through the other place, it was amended to embrace what is now Clause 65, which very properly removes the defence of consent in cases of rough sex where someone suffers serious injury or death. Embracing this provision, the bill before us rightly makes it very plain that sexual violence is part of domestic abuse. My Lords, one of the very striking things about the debate in the other place that gave rise to Clause 65 is that it was formed by material that made it plain that there is a connection between an interest in experimenting with rough sex practices and the prior consumption of pornography depicting rough sex practices. My Lords, Louise Perry of We Can't Consent to It, the key group that campaigned for Clause 65, said, "We cannot really ignore the porn factor. It's there at a click of a button and can be accessed at such a young age. And the algorithms push you into a rabbit hole of more and more extreme stuff." The argument for Clause 65 was also informed by St. Vanna Comries, who polled 2,049 men in Great Britain between the 7th and 10th February last year for Radio 5 Live and BBC Radio Scotland. The polling asked the following questions. Thinking specifically of times you performed slapping, choking, gagging, or spitting during consensual sexual activity, to what extent do you think pornography influenced your desire to do so? My Lords, the answers were striking. 57% of those questions said it did, of which 20% said it influenced their acting in that way. And I quote, "a great deal." My Lords, I am very pleased that the other place amended this bill to insert Clause 65, which addresses problems resulting from rough sex practices. However, to date, my Lords, Parliament has only followed through on the logic of Clause 65 taking rough sex seriously at the level of dealing with the consequences of this form of domestic violence. We have not exhibited the same level of concern in relation to the steps that can be taken to prevent this form of sexual violence in the first place. My Lords, we need joined up thinking here. We need action to prevent injury or death through rough sex, as well as criminal justice measures to ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. My Lords, one of the most basic strategies of preventing in this regard is to protect under 18s from material that normalizes the expectation of violence in sexual relationships. Taking this step would constitute strategic investment in the next generation to ensure that as children enter adulthood, they do not do so believing that violence is a natural part of sexual relationships with all that this will mean for their adult behaviour. My Lords, the irony, of course, is that Parliament has passed legislation that protects under 18s from such material on commercial pornographic websites, but the government has refused to implement it. My Lords, had the government implemented Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act 2017 in 2019, under 18s would now be protected from exposure to pornographic content on pornographic websites, including significant rough sex material. An interviewee said, in a recent government report, and I quote, on Pornhub, you don't have to look in the rough sex category to get rough sex. They're just standard videos for men having sex with women by grabbing them by the throat. My lords, of course, when the government announced that they were not going to implement Part 3 in October 2019, they only acknowledged one downside this approach, that of delay. But they suggested, my lords, that having to wait was worthwhile because the forthcoming online safety bill would actually better protect children from commercial pornographic sites than Part 3. However, in December 2020, when responding to the online harm consultation, the government conceded, firstly, that not only will there be a huge delay in providing protection to under 18s until probably 2023 and quite possibly even later, but secondly, that the alternative means of protecting children from commercial pornographic sites would also be much weaker. My lords, in the first instance, they confirmed that unlike Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act, the protections afforded under Online Harms Bill will only engage with user-generated content and not non-user-generated content. My lords, in the second instance, the detail that they provided about enforcement did not provide the reassurance required. Noble lords will recall that when Parliament scrutinised the Digital Economy Act, the point was made of the 50 most accessible pornographic websites in the UK, none were based in the UK, and that consequently, the only way to gain leverage over the sites in other jurisdictions in relation to enforcing age verification blocks would be through IP blocking. A site accessing the UK market from Russia without robust age verification checks would be told by the regulator to put robust age verification checks in place within a certain time frame or risk being blocked. The site would then have to make a decision to either put in place robust age verification checks or lose significant UK revenue as a result of blocking. However, my lords, in responding to the online harms consultation in December last year, the government proposed fines as the main means of enforcement and only seemed to entertain IP blocking as a last resort, which is very, very concerning. My lords, during the second reading, I did raise these concerns along with Lord Alton, Lord McCall, Lord Marrow, and Baroness Eaton. Since that debate, the government has taken two steps, which really only amplifies the difficulty. Firstly, on the 26th January, the Noble Baroness, the Minister, wrote to the peers to address the points we had made in relation to pornography at second reading. However, rather than addressing the presenting problem, the letter simply repeats it, making it plain that unlike the Digital Economy Act, the Online Harms Bill will only engage pornographic sites that, and I quote, host user-generated content or facilitate online user interaction. My lords, I am fully aware that the Online Harms Bill will have a much wider focus than the Digital Economy Act, engaging pornography on social media, which I lobbied for, as well as online harms that have nothing to do with pornography. My lords, I welcome this. However, when people like myself called on the government to take steps to protect under 18s from pornography on social media, as well as commercial pornographic websites, this was on the basis that the protections in relation to commercial pornographic websites should be implemented immediately and certainly not be made weaker. Furthermore, my lords, when viewed specifically from the perspective of our domestic abuse debate today, the proposals not to focus on non-user generated pornography content makes no sense at all, because depictions of rough sex are just as likely in non-user generated pornography as they are in user-generated pornography. Secondly, my lords, there's a government response to a specific request made by Lord Alton at second reading. In his speech, the Noble Lord specifically asked that the government should publish the long-awaited research it commissioned on the impact of pornography consumption on male attitudes and behavior in response to the reports produced by the Women and Equalities Committee. My Lords, on the 15th of January, that research was then quietly published, and yet, despite the fact that the minister was asked specifically about it, her letter on the 26th of January makes no reference to this important development. I only discovered the research by accident. Here it is, my Lords. My Lords, the findings are hugely important for this debate. The research demonstrates that there is now even more reason for the government to acknowledge how accessing pornography generates the idea that violence in sexual relationships is normal with all its behavioral consequences in adulthood. Firstly, literature review on adult males aged 16 and over concludes there is substantial evidence of an association between the use of pornography and harmful sexual attitudes and behaviors towards women. And it is clear that the relationship between pornography consumption and harmful attitudes does exist. And this is especially true for the use of violent pornography. My Lord, it also states that there's a great deal of easy to access mainstream pornography depicts to various levels sexual violence to female degradation, with the perpetrators of aggression usually male, and the targets of aggression overwhelmingly female. My Lords, the report also notes that professionals working with clients aged 16 and over who had either exhibit harmful sexual behaviors towards women or were at risk of doing so had said, and I quote, "The view that pornography played a role in their clients' harmful attitude and or behaviors was undisputed." My Lords, this is a huge revelation to my amendment 177A with its focus on under 18s, because the professionals said that for young people, pornography is seen as providing a template for sex and sexual relationships and what sexual relationships should look like. One stated, porn comes up in probably 80 or 90% of my cases, that they have done, and what they have done, have been influenced by what they have seen. For them, the internet is fact. My Lords, in order to fully appreciate the significance of these reports, it is important to revisit the consideration of this bill in the other place. My Lords, the Honourable Member of Congleton tabled an amendment on the connection between pornography consumption and domestic violence, and in the course of moving it, asked the government when its promised research on the impact of pornography consumption would be published. The Minister responded in a way that most listeners would assume suggested that the research was not ready and therefore ongoing. My Lords, what the publication of the reports on January 2021 makes clear, as shown on the front of these covers, is that the research was actually prepared for publication by the government's Equalities Office for February 2020, a month before lockdown. This means, my Lords, that the government has sat on research with significant implications for discussion of domestic violence for nearly a year. The direct consequences of this is that MPs have been denied the opportunity to enlighten their debate on the bill, which is now before us today, with the relevant findings of the research, when this was wholly unnecessary, because the research was concluded before first reading in the other place on the 3rd of March 2020. My Lords, when this failing is considered in the context of the failure of the government's letter to peers to address the question asked by Lord Alton, one is tempted to conclude that the government was hoping that no one would spot the research. My Lords, I am saddened and disappointed by this. I'm sure other noble lords will feel the same way too by this discovery. My Lords, this unhappy episode certainly does not build trust and compounds a sense that going forward, we need answers and quickly. But my Lords, there is a way forward. what I strongly believe the government needs to do in order for me not to push my amendment is, my lords, for me to ask the noble Baroness the Minister, for whom I have great respect, to make two central commitments. Firstly, my lords, that the provision in the Online Harms Bill for addressing commercial pornographic websites will be robust as those in Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act. These provisions must fully engage pornographic websites showing both non-user generated and user-generated pornography, and provide enforcement mechanisms through IP blocking that are as robust and as accessible as those in Part 3. Secondly, my lords, given the fact that the Online Harms Bill still has not been published, and there is very little chance that it will protect children, and very little chance that it will protect children from exposure to online pornography, including pornography depicting rough sex act, for at least another 2 years and probably more, that the government will now implement Part 3 of the Digital Economy Act as an interim measure to protect our children long term. Because, as I always say, childhood lasts a lifetime. My lords, I beg to move.